Some people were saying there was unnecessary nudity. There really wasn't that much nudity, though.
No, I don't think so. I think if any of the nudity it wasn't even necessarily sexual either. It almost gave to me personally, like, being, like, proud of your femininity more so than it is, like, big boobs. Hello and welcome to another episode of Literary Liberation Podcast. Today we'll be discussing, analyzing, and reviewing Slewfoot by Brom. Mariah and I have adopted a Palestinian family that is currently still stuck in Gaza. Mohammed's neighborhood was bombed and killed 22 members of his family, leaving him responsible for his 4 younger siblings who were pulled from the rubble. We have their family's GoFundMe, link in the description, and they are very close to their goals, so please donate below. We are on an episode of Left of the Projectors podcast. That episode is about the first Shrek movies, and that is currently out now on Left of the Projectors podcast. Don't forget there's a link below to sign up for our free newsletter where you can get more information about us and the podcast. For more content outside of the podcast, please check out our Instagram and TikTok at Literary Liberation and Twitter at LitLibPodcast. I'm your co-host, Kristen. You can find me at KRXXTXN on all social media platforms.
And I'm Mariah, and you can find me at Hungry Rye on all social media platforms.
To the actual
So this
book.
is a book I have been trying to get Kristen to read for a while. I very much enjoyed it. I ended up reading this back in January. It was what a time to read this. We'll just talk about
Brom.
I don't know, Brom. This is like one of those books that I think everyone at this point is recommending for the spooky season, and I think it pretty much fits. It's like a witchy Puritan style, like settler colonial America book, and it kind of just like hits the nail on the head for everything that you could want for a spooky book, in my opinion, for the fall season, up until Halloween at least.
Yeah. I've seen there's somebody that I follow on TikTok that they were trying to read this earlier in the year, but then they were like, I cannot read this any other time of year. This is only like a purely like spooky season read, really. Like if you're a big mood reader, I guess. It's more of like a mood read where like I could see people not wanting to read this any other time of year. Like I don't know how you read this in January. It's not January vibes at all.
I don't know. I saw it recommended so many times in January that I was just like, or not in January, in like October, and other people were reviewing it, and I was still getting a lot of like the fall reviews. So I ended up just like reading it on a whim because I was kind of tired of some of the other stuff that I was reading. And I just really enjoyed it. It was like one of the first books that I finished in January of this year, I'm pretty sure.
And we're finally reviewing it at the end of October.
So hopefully my memory serves me right, and luckily I took notes while I was reading it for each chapter. What else was I gonna say? So a lot of my memories around this book and it being recommended is that it constantly was included in books of like the unhinged woman trope. So it's kind of the tipping point, I guess, of me getting interested in reading like literary fiction because like this was included with Bunny and whatnot. And then I remember seeing it a lot in the horror section at Barnes and Noble, and the cover of it is beautiful. Brom is an incredible artist. I don't think this is like the thing that people will deny. I really do like a lot of his art. When I was doing research on the artist or on who he was, I found out that he did a lot of art for Magic the Gathering. He also did video game covers for Doom and several of the Diablo games, and then he was a concept artist for movie covers for the following Sleeping Hollow, oh my god. First Sleepy Hollow, Galaxy Quest, Scooby Doo, and Van Helsing, to name a few. So I thought that was really cool. So he's been in a lot of different genres of media and entertainment, and I thought that was really interesting because I don't often see this when it comes to authors.
Yeah, like usually writing is like their only thing. Like they don't do work outside of, where it seems like Brom is almost like an artist first, a writer second.
Yeah, and definitely can see that. And what was so beautiful of like reading this book that I appreciated, and I think Kristen felt the same way that I did because I didn't realize till the very end that he had done pictures and like the artwork for all of the characters in his book. So
Oh,
like
yeah, at
there's
the
no
end.
need for the fan art. He already did it. He was like, this is like the image that he has in his head when he was writing these characters. And I thought that was a very unique aspect to these books. And I think that's also why people are just so like, I don't know, that maybe this is rated so highly and cherished. And
I
I don't know where I'm saying or going with this, but you know what I mean? Like people really love this book. It's a very popular book, and I
um
feel like this is one of the reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think the artwork was really stunning. I didn't even know it was him that did the artwork, like, throughout the book, because I don't think it's, like, very clearly mentioned that, like, it's illustrated by him because throughout, like, each at the end of every chapter, pretty much, there is, like, some type of artwork at the end of the chapter, and then obviously, like, the drawings at the end where I didn't realize those were actually his drawings, because I do at least notice in a lot of contemporary romance now and, like, modern romance that is currently popular in BOOK-TOK that a lot of, authors end up commissioning, like, artists to do the fan art for their books and stuff, and that's kind of usually how characters get their faces is just through, like, a separate artist working with the author versus this just being the direct author with their own thoughts, their own ideals, and they're the ones that's, like, creating that medium as well, which is very unique and not something that we normally see in at least, like, modern books that we're reading, at least, for me personally.
Yeah, I can't think of anything outside of like manga artists and
Yeah,
writers where they're doing both things. So this was a very unique mix of the two. Um,
for it being, like, a typical,
so
like, traditionally published book. That's, like, not manga, not anything else, like, this is just a book that features illustrations throughout it. Because you said you did the research on, like, his politics and stuff, and you didn't really find much. He doesn't have much of an online presence,
yeah, there's not a whole lot about it. He was born in the South in like the 60s,
so he's
born
old.
to like a military family. Yeah, so he's not like a young author. And I think you can kind of tell in the way that like he wrote and like tells his story. I haven't read any of his other books, but I do have a couple of them. I think I'm going to read the Krampus one during Christmas time because I thought that would be fun. But other than that, there's not a whole lot about him online. I tried looking up stuff, and the only thing that popped up for anyone named Brom was like another man from like the 16 or I don't know, like 1800s, and he had like controversy surrounding him. And I was like, okay, that's understandable. It's another like a white white man. Then it's like, yeah, sounds about right. But other than that, I cannot find anything about him. So if anyone does know anything, at the time of publishing this, we are not just saying that he objectively does not. I just couldn't find anything.
I mean, the only thing I could necessarily see is because he has it seems like from what we've researched on, he did work closely with Blizzard. I just finished Play Nice by Jason Schreier is his name, and so, like, obviously throughout that whole book, it kind of talked a lot it didn't talk about Brom specifically as an artist, but it did talk about, like, the culture surrounding, like, Blizzard and the people that work there and about how it's very much like a bro culture, and they did end up having a lot of, like, sexual assault issues and things like that, so the fact to me, like, he's worked with Blizzard, obviously, since I think one of the first couple of Diablo games when he started, and he most recently made the cover for the newest Diablo game that came out last year. So the fact that he's still working closely with Blizzard, which I don't know how much of that was within his department or even within the area, or if he's even like if he's more like a freelance artist for Blizzard could be a whole thing too. I don't know if he's on Blizzard payroll, but I do know there are controversies surrounding Blizzard, and I know like if you're associating yourself with Blizzard, you might end up catching some strays because they are a pretty controversial company.
Yeah, I'm curious what's going to come out in the future. And then I just know he's been working with Wizards of the Coast with Magic the Gathering. So he's been in that realm. I imagine a lot of the people in those like the top like big wigs and those communities, like they probably talk. There has to be a reason that he works with so many different people in entertainment, how he's made a name for himself. And we just don't know. He does a very good job of keeping himself
Separate,
private.
yeah, separate from
Which, you
those.
know what, like, I can appreciate to an extent. He's not just out here, like, publicizing every moment of his life where I feel like people are
Too
expected
ingrained
to
to
do.
in
So,
internet culture, but he's also kind of. If you said he was born in the '60s, is that not boomer era?
yeah, I mean, he's technically a
Like,
boomer.
so, I mean, from what from, like, obviously, we're only able to extract, like, his political ideals from what we've read of Slewfoot. That is like kind of what we'll end up speculating. But I do think for Slewfoot, I don't think for it taking place in like the 1600s, it's not necessarily like an anti-progressive book either. I do think it's progressive for what it is. Because obviously you're following like puritanical evangelical Christians basically, where these people are not going to be your most progressive people in the 1600s, you know? Like that's just not what society was.
Yes, which I think is a good segue to give the Goodreads summary of what this book is for people that don't know. It is set in colonial New England. Slewfoot is a tale of magic and mystery, of triumph and terror, as only dark fantasist Brom can tell it. A spirited young English woman, Abatha, arrives at a Puritan colony betrothed to a stranger, only to become quickly widowed when her husband dies under mysterious circumstances. All alone in this pious and patriarchal society, Abatha fights for what little freedom she can grasp onto while trying to stay true to herself and her past. Enter Slewfoot, a powerful spirit of antiquity, newly woken and trying to find his own role in the world, healer or destroyer, protector or predator. But as the shadows walk and the villagers start dying, a new rumor is whispered, which both Abatha and Slewfoot must swiftly decide who they are and what they must do to survive in a world intent on hanging any who meddle in the dark arts. Complete with 8 pages of Brom's mesmerizing full color artwork and chapter illustrations throughout, his latest book is sure to delight. That is what it says on Goodreads. Hopefully, I didn't butcher that too bad. I am having the hardest time reading anything off the script, so we got to go straight off the dome today for the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you kind of end up just following Abatha and Slewfoot, which he doesn't even get called Slewfoot throughout the book, which is a little confusing to me personally. Is there anything else we want to say before going to any praises or criticisms without spoiling first?
Um, Let me try to think.
Well, I guess I can go first. Let me check to see what my story graph rating is because I finished this a few days
I
ago.
rated it a 4.75 star when I had initially read it, and like now I would probably give it like a 4.5 because I was thinking back and some of the pacing of it is kind of funny. I do think I agree with some of the reviews saying that they could have cut like 50 to 100 pages out of it because it was a little
Yeah,
redundant, but I ultimately like the storytelling and the way like the character arc for Abatha grows and progresses. I don't think you will be disappointed. I do think it's a very entertaining story, and I still am chasing the high that this book gave me. Nothing has quite come close to it except for maybe Between Two Fires, which I really enjoyed, which is another dark fantasy novel. And yeah, so if you're looking for anything or if you've already read this and you're looking for something kind of like adjacent, maybe check that out. But you can't go wrong with it. I think to read it for the culture to understand it, give it a go.
I think if you're more of a reader like me, it could probably end up being hit or miss for you. I ended up rating it at 3.25, and I know people hear three stars. That sucks. For me, it's a little bit above middle of the road. I think it's a little repetitive, redundant, like people have criticized. I'm somebody who loves long things, and I was complaining to Mariah that some of these parts definitely felt like a slog to get through. Like it was not something whenever I get to the last, I would say 100 pages in a book. Usually I sit and read the last 100 pages in about a sitting or two. Like whenever I get towards the end of the book, I'm usually finishing it with it's less than 100 pages. For this one, there would be points where, like, I had, like, 30 pages left, and I just couldn't get myself to sit down and read it. Like, I did not have no will, no want to read it just because I do think it was a little bit grueling at times, which is that's the vibe you're looking for. I think that's going to be, like, the vibe of where it's a little bit slower, a little bit more reflective almost. I do think it could be something in your wheelhouse, but for me personally, and it could just be the vibe I'm in, I wanted something faster, I wanted something more, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely a slower moving book, and we can get into like I don't know. I don't know where you want to start with this because some of the I don't even really care to read some of the criticisms because I think it's kind of silly when people are like, oh, it's not like historically accurate when I don't think it ever was intended to be like a
I mean,
historical fiction. Like it's just
spoiler alert, witches aren't real. Nobody was casting magic back in the day, and the devil is also not real. So the devil was not going to show up in 1600s uh American wherever they are. I don't even know what state they're in. Somewhere up north.
I'm assuming they're in like
They're
Massachusetts.
like in New
That's
England
where my
area.
default is.
Definitely New England
But
area, but like the devil was not
it
going to
doesn't
actually
really
show
make
up there.
sense. It's like people getting upset that like Babel wasn't 100% historically accurate when again it was a
You're
fantasy
telling me
novel
there's not
with
magic
magic.
in the Babel Tower that people are inscribing words onto metallic bars to make magic happen? That you're telling me that doesn't actually happen at Oxford? Yeah, right.
I thought that was really silly. And then also people are like, "Oh my god, a book written by a man who's writing a female main character." I also think that's really strange. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong or bad about that, especially since I mean, there's nothing that really goes bad. People are like, "Oh, well, she's a pick me." What would you rather have given like the time and like that this is set in if she was not trying to go against what like the Christians, like the Puritans were saying and like the patriarchy, like just go with the flow? Like what does that mean?
I think that's
I
almost
don't
like a
understand.
critique of, I guess, because they were outspoken. I guess she was too outspoken to like men and stuff like that. But I know, like, obviously, culturally, we are raised different now than what we would have been in like the 1600s, too. But I look at myself and how autistic people still existed back in the 1600s, even though they didn't have the words, they didn't have the terminology, they didn't understand anything like that back in the day, or even understanding like any type of mental illness. But those things were still around during that time. So women that were depressed or manic or something like that could be accused of something like that, versus also women with autism that are speaking out whenever they're uncomfortable in situations because they don't understand the social cues or different things like that. So I don't necessarily think that it's unrealistic for a woman to be outspoken in this time just because history has gone so long with silencing outspoken women for so long.
I to see it like that's what I mean. It's like I think a lot of people who are not like principled in any sort of like Marxism or feminism or any sort of liberation ideology really understand what exactly that entails because their understanding of these issues really is only within the framework of the last, I don't know, 20 to 50 years.
Mhm.
So, whereas Chris and I spend a lot of time looking at the actual like utilizing dialectical and material or dialectical materials is what I mean. I can't talk today. That like Marx set forth. So when we're evaluating history and we're reading, say, Caliban and the Witch by Sylvia Federici, and we're looking at how like primitive accumulation and the witch trials like played in together with the development of early capitalism, we can kind of see like where these things originate from. So a story written by a man, like the way she acted, isn't inherently like she's not being depicted incorrectly in accordance with history. Like there had to be outliers. Like I don't understand. These are like the same people that are like, we're the children of the witches you didn't burn, but it's
Yeah.
like, don't you think that they would have been like speaking out or would they have been passive? What does that
Yeah.
mean to you?
Be
I'm just very confused, all in all, with like reviews like that. And I know that was a bit of a rant and ramble and it went all over the place, but I don't really understand where people are coming from.
I just think it's a lot of people that maybe have the critique about, like, maybe not necessarily because, like, one thing you have to do is that, like, you have to remember Slewfoot is a fictional novel about a fictionalization of events based in reality, but, like, the only thing that's, like, based in reality within this is that's the fact that women were incessantly put on trial during the 1600s because women were being accused of witches for whatever reason it have you, because these men wanted their land, because these men wanted blah blah blah. Like it's an inherently like patriarchal thing, and that is the only realistic element within that in Slewfoot makes sense objectively. Like I don't think that's a fair critique to have. Where you can have a critique of I don't like the characters, like oh you may not like Abatha. I don't necessarily think she's even a likable main character because I know with depending on how outspoken women are and things like that, that they can be viewed in a more negative light. And I know that, like, I get viewed in a negative light a lot of the times whenever I'm very outspoken and stuff like that because that's just my personality and the way that I am. So I can see, oh, you don't like, if you don't like characters in a book, then you're not going to like that book. But saying that it's not accurate to history doesn't make sense because I don't necessarily think it was trying to be accurate to history. This is not a history book. This is a fictional novel fictionalizing the events
I don't
of
know
history.
what people like. I guess if like your only understanding of this instance of like US history is rooted in, say, the Crucible,
Mhm.
like you read that in high school and that's like your only framework, like maybe you should go back and like actually learn like the history from like a real
Like an
like
actual
academic
textbook.
perspective. Question mark? I don't know. I just think it's weird because like Abatha has a very strong sense of justice, and with her husband, who we're kind of led, and we get like the impression that he has some sort of disability, but
Mhm.
it doesn't explicitly say what it is. Like she has that strong sense of justice that a lot of like autists have, and she is very outspoken, very protective of her husband, despite it being an arranged marriage. She's just like she has that love for him and genuinely wants like his best well-being. She doesn't want him being taken advantage of by like his brother who like wants his land and his money and says, "Oh, you have to do X, Y, and Z." Like, no, she's really trying to like do her best given the conditions that she lives under. Like she can only push so much. And
Mhm.
even then it ends up backfiring her in the end.
Trying to think if there's anything we really wanna say before we get into spoilers either though, because I feel like
I think this
since
is
we're
spoilers. I thought we were in the spoiler zone.
well, we didn't
We're just ending
say it.
it.
Well, what we
Yeah,
haven't
I
really
said
said
before
anything.
we had.
No, you didn't.
Oh, well, okay, so now that we're in the spoiler zone, officially, we were unofficially, and now we are officially. I think the criticism that does make the most sense, and I don't have enough knowledge about this, is the way that the author describes the indigenous community and also the lore and like their spiritual understanding of like what is happening. I did read in some of the reviews that it was possible that like or like it was I don't know if it was rumored or he said it somewhere that he had a sensitivity reader. So usually when authors have sensitivity readers, they'll have people from certain marginalized demographic, if you're not part of that demographic and you're writing about it, who will like kind of vet the content and make sure that it's good. So I have no idea. I don't really know anything about this because I am not well versed in this. So I do think that is a valid criticism, is the way he handles it. He handles it better than the author of Stolen Tongues, for example, who kind of went on like this white fragility rant at the end of his book when it came to acknowledging whether or not a writer can write about different identities if you're not part of them. But I did see that, and I know you also saw it somewhere else. So I thought it might be of value to at least mention.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, obviously, like, I'm not super well versed in, like, I think it's the Pequot tribe is how you pronounce it. You can totally tell me if I'm saying it wrong. That is, like, the main tribe that is talked about within this community that, like, they don't even live in there. Like, obviously, they're calling them, like, they are not referring to them as, like, indigenous people or anything like that because, historically, that would make sense, obviously, so, like, those things, but I don't necessarily know that, like, the way that any of those people were portrayed or correct, but I do think since this book is a very, like, white-centric perspective, that it's because it's in 3rd person, but it's 3rd person limited depending on the section you're in. You know? So I do think that because, like, you never really necessarily get any of the Native Americans' perspectives is that since they have such a white centric ideal, they're going to portray them in racist manners, which I mean, that's one thing where you either want this book to be historically accurate, I guess, if you want those things, but I don't necessarily if you had a sensitivity reader I don't know what they said to change or what, like, I really don't know, like, historically how to portray that in that way because we know what white people were doing to Native Americans during that time, being incredibly racist and doing things, like, throughout the book, like, what they do and how they talk to them and how they react to their tribes and things like that. But I don't think that this anyways glorifies it either, though, like, because the people that do it are the villains too.
Yes, absolutely. I do, and I did appreciate like looking up who this tribe was and currently still is, where they were located at this time is accurate to where the story takes place. So it wasn't like he just picked like Cherokee Indian
Yeah.
or Native American, like how they would have described them. What is like the full name for it? The Cherokee
Well, I do think this book also does a better job at portraying a Native American tribe.
Nation. That's the way to say it.
Oh,
Cherokee Nation. Because some
um,
people say it the way that I say it growing up here, and I know that's not accurate.
I don't know what you guys
Yeah,
say there.
just nation. Huh.
I don't know. But I mean, like, comparatively to like things that have come out, like when the modern times, like Twilight is a one that is a very big that's been critiqued about Stephanie Meyer's portrayal of the indigenous cultures throughout Twilight. And whenever she's received any type of criticism for it, she's just like, well, whatever sort of thing. Like, she has no responsibility for that. So I don't know. I guess if Brom hasn't said anything about this, if he says he has a sensitivity reader, then I don't know what the proper move is going forward for that personally.
I guess I'm just curious if anyone is part of that demographic or knows more about it. If they have any insight or information about it, we'd love to read it. We just thought it was very important to mention in this because I think that was one of the biggest criticisms about the actual content because it is rooted in some historical relevancy. However, I would not go as far to call it like a historical fiction. Like it's set in New England
Yeah.
colonial times, but that's about as far as it's going to go. At least he went as far to try to keep things as accurate as possible, but I also don't know if they could have been done better.
Yeah.
And if how it could have been. So, if anyone has any insight, we are open to hearing that. So that is our not perspective. It was just us discussing it as people who are not super versed on this.
Yeah.
That was a little long-winded. Anyways,
Moving on.
the actual substance of this book.
I do think one thing, like, obviously, this book is very critical of the patriarchy, especially with, like, obviously, we still live in, like, a patriarchal society now, but the times then, it was much worse for women because women weren't even, like, basically expected to work on the farm or do anything like that. So, whenever Abatha after Edward's untimely death, when Abatha becomes like the main homesteader for the farm, she's basically set up to fail too. And I do think that it is like a nice like even if it was maybe unrealistic in many ways that Abatha was able to pull herself up by her bootstraps and do this. This is still a story I think of hope in that way because like you're not going to want to read about somebody that fails. Like then there would be no story.
Yeah, she's doing the best with what she has. She's one person trying to run this farm, and like nothing that she does seems to work. And they were having issues before Edward died,
Yeah.
so that made it's just like compounded. And her brother is trying to essentially,
Brother-in-law.
um, yes, her brother-in-law is going through the effort to basically try to keep her as like an indentured servant of sorts because it's his brother's wife, and because she's a widow, he thinks that he's entitled to this land. And then also her, because she doesn't have a spouse, needs to live under his rule. Let me see. Let me go to some of my notes about this because I did have some very colorful things to say about him. I think the first chapter when I was reading this, I said it gave like the witch vibes with like the two V's,
Never seen it.
like the witch, which is an A24 film.
I
It's
know what
very
you're talking
slow. You
about,
may
though.
not like it, but it's very similar.
Probably
And then
boring.
oh, you can see my phone
Yeah.
doing that. That's funny. Chapter 2, Wallace is an ass. That was
I didn't
accurate.
start
Chapter 4, I
highlighting
was
things
very
till chapter
confused.
7.
Yeah, at chapter 7, I said, fuck Wallace and his bitch ass son. Trying to steal away the corn so that Abatha wouldn't be able to make her debt up. And I thought that was funny.
Well,
So,
there's
like, you know what?
the
I get it.
quote too where it's so very capitalist because he tries to sell this tub of like honey wine basically to like the shopkeeper or whatever. And we just talked about basically like lowering the quality of your product whenever we were just talking about the Goosebumps episode a couple of
Oh, the mead. The mead,
yes.
yes.
Yeah. That's what honey wine is it not? Mead?
Mead is like its own fermented alcohol, but
No, it's made out of
think
honey though. It's honey wine. That's what it's considered, I'm pretty sure.
N mead?
Yes.
I thought mead was just mead. It's just an alcoholic beverage with fermented honey and water. It's not wine, it's mead.
But it's like
Wine
honey
is made
wine.
with fruit. It's alcoholic, but it's not wine. They're
I think they
different.
still call it mead though. Yeah, you look up honey wine and mead pops up, but babes. Mead, also known as honey wine, is an alcoholic beverage.
I've never heard it referred to as honey wine. I've only ever heard to it referred to as mead.
Okay, well, that's your ignorance showing.
I'll ignore that.
Okay, well,
Anyways,
whatever. He was trying to sell this honey wine, mead, whatever you want to call it. But the guy didn't want to give him as much money because it wasn't as full as whatever. And he was like, "Oh, like you owe me more." He was like, "Well, the guy was like, "Well, I'll only give you this because this feels like it's a little empty." And then he goes, "It's not." But he knew it was. He knew he added a bit more water than he should have as well, trying to stretch his meager honey supply as far as it could go. So it's like literally like capitalism right there, where you're trying to make a weaker product sell for more money too, which we currently see in everything all the time now. You know?
isn't that interesting?
It just
Isn't
reminded
that
me of the
isn't that
Goosebumps
crazy?
discussion
Right?
that we had.
What else
Oh,
did I write? Oh, I thought it was interesting. If you have any thoughts on this, it was in chapter 8. And I said, I wondered if the eyes in the church are synonymous to the ones that Abatha and Samson saw when they went into the past. Because when they go into the past, they see eyes. That was like
I
a
thought
really
that was
big
like a
thing. And that's
representation of like stars in the sky.
But then it was also represented in the church. So I didn't know if it was like an all-seeing eye, if it was supposed to be like the holy power or whatever, or what. What your
You're
thoughts were. If
asking
you had
I
anything
did not have
on
any
that.
thoughts for that. That's the thing too with reading this, as I've never grown up as being like a religious person. There was like a time where I tried to go to church for like a year or so, but like I never really got into it. Like religion just isn't for me. Like it's not interesting, you know? And like I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in God, devil, Jesus Christ, whatever have you. Um, so for a lot of this stuff, like a lot of the times, any of like the religious things are just something like I put my horse blinders on and I ignore it.
I wonder if that influences how you sorry, you view and move through some of these books when they have like religious elements, whereas like I have like had to deconstruct a lot of this ideology as I've gotten older, where you've never had to do that. So you kind of read it and you're just like, whatever, and just like move forward. But it has a little bit more of an impact, I think, if you are somebody that grew up under like in the church,
I think it's kind of funny that it's
maybe.
almost like you would think the opposite for us too, especially because like I'm someone who's lived in the South my entire life. I grew up in Georgia and then moved to Kentucky, which you would think are very like heavily religious areas, but because I've lived in more populated areas, that like the religion aspect is not something that's ever been important to me in my life. Like my mom is religious, I guess, but like she tried to push it on me, but like as we all know, stuff does not get pushed on me personally. But so I
Kristen's
don't
like,
know.
try me.
So I don't know if maybe like if I did like grow up more religious and actually like cared about religion growing up, then maybe this would have those things would have impacted me more. But I more imagine as like visions from the past and future seeing in on like this like more abstract, I guess, in that way.
Yeah,
Where it's
I could
not
see that because that was
necessarily
like a
like a
really
god.
weird part of the book.
Yeah.
Is
Where
when they're
like when
traveling
they're
through the
full.
past and the imagery where it almost feels like avant-garde. It's a little bit more artsy and interpretive, whereas the rest is pretty like straightforward. This is kind of where
Yeah.
it gets weird, where you don't really know um I think, like, to me, when I like think back on this book, I almost felt as though the holy power, which, if you're reading it, it kind of like read like Jesus Christ or God, was like happy and supported Samson and Abatha. But it was ironic when they come back and the way that the church is conducting itself and actually imposing, when like the word of God, based on their interpretation, even though it wasn't actually rooted in perhaps what was intended. So it was kind of like playing into the hypocrisy of Christianity, where it was cherry picking the bits that suited its narrative, and usually that was rooted in like a white colonial patriarchal perspective.
Mhm. Which is it's crazy too that the fact that, like, we've grown so much as, like, a nation and as, like, a society and stuff, but then we still get those interpretations of the Bible and religion now too.
Which there's a lot to say. There's a lot of historical developments and reasons why that is, especially in like Western society. And I think honestly, largely is Christianity is a colonial
Ideology?
religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's like what it was rooted for. Some of the original colonists were missionaries when they went to Africa. And I think that's very telling.
Mhm. 'Cause
So it makes a lot of sense, like why America is so like Christian centered, and they apply that lens to like the rest of the world. Like, oh, this is like the objective truth for society, and this is how it is. When in reality, although Christian is a major religion, so is Islam.
yes. And
But Islam
even
has become like a racial, like a racializing term. Like if people are Muslim, that's usually like a negative connotation applied to people in like the Western society.
mhm.
Sorry, that was I don't know. We're
That's
this
a
book is
little off
kind of
of the
crazy though, because it touches on so much
Yeah.
happens, and like the way like you can talk about so many different historical things that take place. And this is what I mean though, is I think a lot of people who were rating it and they just straight up rated it a 1 star because they're like, oh, this is silly. This is just like I'm a not like a pick me girl. And I was like, I think you're missing the point. And other people in the comments of the reviews were also saying, like, did we read the same book? Some people were saying there was unnecessary nudity. There really wasn't that much nudity, though.
No, I don't think so. I think if any of the nudity was, it wasn't even necessarily sexual either. It almost gave to me personally, like, being, like, proud of your femininity more so than it is, like, big boobs, you know?
Because there really is nothing, like, inherently wrong or moralizing about, like, the human form or body,
Mhm.
especially if, like, from an artistic perspective. This wasn't done in our opinion as,
Sexual?
like, sexual, like, it's just like a man, like, "Oh my god," but it just kind of was. That was very sweet, and I really like that. It was nice. It was just, like, a very endearing moment, especially because it was such a taboo thing, and it was just, like, their
Mm,
way of bonding with each other. I don't see that as being anti-feminist, and I think that
yeah.
if you are very hung up on that, like, maybe you should evaluate why that is. Like, why do you feel that way?
Mhm. Because that is very much, the Christian ideal right there, like, that this whole book, like, ends up even critiquing too is, like, very much like, why are you so against, like, the women being naked and stuff, but then men can go out and work shirtless and it means nothing sort of thing, where it's like, you don't view those in the same light, and there's a reason why that is, because originally, like, boobs and, like, were not made to be sexualized, they're made to, like, a mother to give food to their child before, like, formulas and things like that, so it's really interesting that the fact that somebody's like, "Oh, nudity, that's, like, sexual content, and that makes me uncomfortable," which is like, if that's you, then maybe this isn't the book for you, but it's also not, like, rampant in any way either.
Well, especially since it was, like, a relevant theme. It wasn't like it was completely irrelevant, and
Yeah.
also, like, playing into, like, some of the, stereotypes around the witches. I think it kind of made sense why it was done
Yeah.
in that way,
Because,
but
like, her showing her body was showing that how ungodly she was as a woman was, like, what the men took out of it, when in reality, I mean, even some of the times where it's, like, her working on the farm because her hair is up and her, like, shirt was hanging low or whatever, and, like, the men that were spying on her were getting turned on from it because, like, they're, like, repressed sexually because of society back in that day, but then, of course, instead of reflecting on themselves and why they feel that way about a woman working and who is just sweating and being hot, and then she's villainized for that, is like, you gotta comprehend this stuff yourself. We can't, like, explain it all to you, you know?
Yeah. It's I don't know. I don't know. I just don't know why people think that way. I was taken aback. I thought people would just be like saying that it was slow, or maybe they just didn't like the overall like storytelling, but like some of the most random stuff that I didn't even think of was showing up in the criticisms of like the one star, which mind you, less than 1% of the reviews. There's like 45,000 um I don't know if there's 45,000 ratings, and then I don't know how many people actually wrote reviews. Um, it was a lot, but less than 1% of them were one star. So overwhelmingly, people still very much enjoyed it. These were just a very, I guess, loud minority that I am choosing to represent.
I don't know. Well, because, like, I could tell whenever I was reading this book that, like, because, like, Slewfoot or, like, Samson and Abatha, like, sort of have, like, an inkling of, like, a romantic relationship in ways. I could tell this is such a you book because you're always, like, this is borderline monster romance, in my opinion. Like, it's, like,
Oh
teeters
no,
right on
I
that
didn't want them
edge.
to like necessarily like get together, but
Oh,
there's
but when
just
it
like
happened, it just so happened to work out for you,
it
huh?
was like more of like a camaraderie that they both have where they're kind of like going through self-discovery together because Samson doesn't have any recollection when he wakes up. So, and she doesn't really know who she is outside of like she got sent to the Americas to be a wife.
Yeah, and she's still very
That was
young.
like her
She's,
only
like
form of like mobility in the world was being this one identity, and then she loses that identity. And Samson's also being told by these little woodland critters that he has this thing that needs to do and talk to the pop or like the pawpaw tree.
yeah, the pawpaw tree.
Which some of that I will say, I I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah,
I think back, I don't really know. People were saying that if you wanted like a better story to watch Princess Mononoke, and I don't see the connection between those two, but I don't I don't
but
I don't know
I
because
feel
like
like
I
it's
feel
a
like
good
the
movie,
plot
though.
because like the woodland creatures are like sitting on like an eco-fascism, which Kristen had originally brought up. Like they
Yes.
have
I
like this
have a
really weird
quote.
mentality where all humanity is like detrimental to the forest. And I don't think it was all humanity necessarily because it was just focused around like the settlers.
Listen. So we have I don't know how to say his name. So I'm sorry to everyone here and now, but especially you, Mariah. Uh Mamunapet? Okay. That's how I'm saying it. Anyway, so that's kind of like the overarching, I guess, like villain within the story for Samson and his arc and stuff like that. Who was I don't even know, like they called him a shaman that I guess like his job was to make sure the devil, aka Samson, aka Slewfoot, aka whatever you want to call him, was basically not there to terrorize people because I guess he was so easily influenced by these woodland creatures to cause destruction to anybody that tried to um settle on their land because they're very much like the woodland creatures and stuff. They cared about like the safety of the forest and like the ecological ideals of this, and boy do they have another thing coming in modern day America, let me just say. But um mainly the fact that they were like because they were against, even like I know in a lot of Native American cultures and indigenous peoples cultures, was that they were not over greedy with the land. They did a lot of work on the land and stuff to make sure that like they weren't taking more than what was needed and things like that, versus very differently than I'm sure than what the colonizers were doing whenever they first came to America, basically starting this feudal society. But so the fact like that they were usually I think a lot of indigenous cultures and things like that worked a lot more within the environmental factors and stuff like that, and not just taking it to profit off of the land versus like what I'm sure a lot of the settlers did from early America and like from England and things like that. But the fact that these woodland creatures were even before the settlers came to America, which is when I guess Samson was put down and stuff like that, because they believed that even the indigenous cultures were going to extract more worth than what was needed out of the land too. Because Manu Mom Mamunefit, I don't know how to say his name, sorry, but he said specifically to Samson, they do not wish to share this great land. They were jealous, angry that you dared to help the people. And when you would not drive the people away, would not go against your own nature, they changed your nature. So to me, it kind of shows that, like, the woodland creatures were eco-fascist because they didn't even want any type of people on the land because Samson was willing to be open to the people and work with the people and obviously let humans and creatures profit off of the not profit but like live and survive off the land versus the woodland creatures basically only wanted it to benefit them.
Yeah, I can see that. I couldn't remember all of what happened because it's been so long since I've read it. I just knew there was something there, and I'm glad that you brought up that quote. So it's really interesting. And I'm curious if other people did end up having like a resounding, oh, yes, like we shouldn't have human beings. Like, I'm sure there are people that do share the sentiment of that
Yeah.
because I've seen it. Like, there's like, no, humans are the plight or the blight on the land. Not the plight, the blight with a
Yeah.
B. Um, but in reality it's not because like indigenous people weren't like causing this
Yeah.
issue, like all of these issues. A lot of these issues arise from like white settlers
Yes.
decimating the land, not replanting things in accordance with how they grow, poisoning the soils.
I mean
That is
that's
something that is very unique to early capitalism and industrialization.
yeah. Well, because I mean like that's where one of the main conflicts of the book even happens is because up in the Northeast, New England area is where Wallace, Abatha's brother-in-law, begins trying to grow tobacco in land that is not suited to even grow tobacco in any way, shape, or form. You know, it's too moist up there. It's not dry land like you need in the South, which is why, like, I mean, tobacco is Kentucky's cash crop for a long time in a lot of areas in the South. So it shows that, like, even people moving with, like, lack of knowledge is destroying the land too, which is not where I don't think even just because somebody makes a mistake too, because, like, it's not like they knew then how, like, crops work. There was no factory farming and things like that, so people did have to do trial and error. But whenever there was error, instead of trying to fix their error, they ended up moving on, and I think that's where a lot of issues end up happening as well.
I also think a lot of it kind of stems back to if a lot of these like colonists hadn't like left their homes and had worked on fixing things where they had lived at,
Mhm.
it probably would have been a lot better for them in reality. Like they were just so determined to like practice escapism and do things their way away from the kingdom rather than like organizing within their own communities. And then they just,
But is that almost like
committed
a
genocide against the indigenous peoples.
that's almost like a sentiment now too. Like people's whole thing is like not working to fix what's there. They're like, "Oh, well, if you want this, then you should just leave." Sort of thing. And then like you have all these Trump supporters like, "Oh, if Kamala gets elected, I'm moving away, blah blah blah." It's like, "Why? What?" I literally don't
Because
even
it's easier.
But even
It's
is it
easier if you have
even
like the
easier?
resources. I think, yeah, I mean, it's gotta be than, like, trying to actively, like, work with your neighbors. It's very, like, individualist mindset. It's not rooted in any sort of, like, liberation. This is why, like, the American Revolution is considered, like, a bourgeois revolution because it wasn't rooted in liberating anyone. It was just, like, a separation
Yeah.
from, the monarchy. They didn't wanna pay taxes. That was it. That was the extent. They didn't care about, like, how people were being treated necessarily. They're just like, "Oh, it's my money." And that was, like, at most. That is, like, the most revolutionary any sort of, like, white folk, who don't have any sort of, like, liberation principles
Which
will
can you
get,
name anything
is,
more
like,
American?
a Boston Tea Party.
But I mean, like,
Ugh.
Americans and, like, I think with the way that we've bred capitalism, It's like, this is how people are gonna be
Yeah,
until
and
any type of
it's hard.
toppling.
It's hard being Marxist and, like, seeing everything happening in history, especially right now because we are so close to the new election. It's just it's
I
kinda hard to watch, and seeing similar sentiments and whatnot kind of transpire where people are just like, "I'm leaving, I'm moving the country," and just like, just stay where you are and try to fix where it's at and rectify the mistakes that you've already made. That's that's what you should do.
but it won't happen.
No.
I
Not
hope
right
all the
now,
Trump
unless we have
supporters
more.
leave, so then we can have a real commie Kamala.
Maybe they'll try to go to Mars and then we'll have another Ocean Gate. I don't know. Anything's possible.
We can only hope. Elon Musk, I want you on that first ship to Mars, buddy. The first
Just for
one.
scientific purposes.
You gotta
But I think
go.
we are approaching the very end because it is.
Yes.
I gotta go. Thank you for listening to this episode. This is the last bit of our spookiness, spooky episodes to come out. I know this is coming out on Halloween, so happy Halloween. It was also very like fitting because it's also like Samhain, so
Huh?
cool.
Yeah. Next episode will be on
Magician's Daughter.
by H.G. Perry. I didn't know if you were gonna finish it, so I don't want to say that. But I guess,
I've been reading a chapter a day, so I'm getting through it, and it's a very different change of pace. And then we have Night Bitch, which will be coming out right before the movie, so keep an eye out. Kristen is very excited about this one. She's been
yeah,
itching to talk about it forever.
I love Night Bitch. Anyways, moving on from that, I guess. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our next episode, which will be on The Magician's Daughter. We also did do a podcast with Evan at Left of the Projector on his podcast, us talking about the Shrek movies. So make sure you go to his account, channel, whatever, and check out that episode with us in it if you want to hear us yap about something that's not a book. Other than that, I think that's all we have. So thank you and good night.